Now, in this week's magazine, we review the latest book by Janine di Giovanni. She's been a war correspondent, now an academic at Yale University. She's written about the plight of Christianity in the Middle East. She joins me now. Janine, you've got so many stories inside you. Why did you want to write this one about the fate of religion?
Well, basically, I've been working in the Middle East for 3 decades. And around the time of Saddam Hussein in the early 2000s, I became aware of the Christian communities in Iraq. Now, these are people who are basically living in the land of the prophets, the land of Jonah, of St. Thomas, and how they were in danger of being eradicated entirely. Since the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, in places like Iraq and Syria, these communities who are very ancient, very rooted to their land, are even more vulnerable. So what I decided was really to focus on 4 very distinct communities in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, and in the Gaza Strip, and why they are so desperately important that these people remain in their ancestral lands.
Right. Now, of course, Christianity was a Middle Eastern export, so therefore it's been in the Middle East for way longer than it's been in Europe. So why should it be that after going through 2 millennia of tumult in these countries, it's under its most in danger now, as you say in your book?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's very interesting because most British Christians and American Christians don't really associate. I mean, they know that Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, but they don't really associate the birth of Christianity being in the Holy Land, and that these ancient communities, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Copts, are such a unique part of biblical and indeed history. So really what recent events have led to there could be even extinction within 100 years. First of all, is the rise of radical groups. So let's take the Islamic State. One of their edicts was to basically wipe out Christians in that part of Iraq, which was, of course, Mosul and the northern villages leading into Kurdistan. The second thing, and I've just stressed that each community has their own individual challenges. So for instance, in Iraq, it's geopolitics, but it really also is climate change. Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries in the Middle East in terms of climate change, but it's also about migration, vast migration, that these young people, there's no industry, there's no incentive for them to stay. So every community has a very different story to tell. The Copts in Egypt, for instance, are extremely discriminated against. It's enshrined within the Egyptian constitution that they cannot hold offices of high position in the government or in the army, which of course is an arm of the government. In the Gaza Strip, it's an entirely different thing. There's only 800 Christians left there. And of course, Christianity, Gaza had been entirely Christian until the 4th century. So these 800 remaining people are basically sandwiched in between Hamas and the Israeli occupation. Even though the Israelis withdrew, they're still very much subjugating the people there. The 11-day bombing in May left Gaza devastated again. So each community has unique challenges that are allowing them to remain and indeed to populate, because their numbers are dwindling drastically.
But to what extent were the dictators actually a friend of the Christians? Because let's take Saddam Hussein, for example. His deputy, from memory, Tariq Aziz, was a Christian. In Syria, the Christians had an okay time under Assad. It was when Assad was on the ropes that they started to get worried. And even in Egypt, the Copts were pretty much, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but free to worship in peace until its recent regime changes, and only then do you end up with Christians in Egypt being attacked outside their churches. So I wonder to what extent the regime changes of the last 2 decades have ushered in the forces which have ushered out the Christians.
Absolutely. This was one of the stranger things that I came across. So you're absolutely right. The Christians were protected in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. There was a sort of unofficial deal with the devil that for their voting bloc, in exchange, they would basically be left alone. The same thing in Syria. And this is something that really shocked me, especially as I reported the war in Syria. when I would go to the Christian communities there, they would, basically state their absolute love for Bashar al-Assad. Now, whether or not this is a fear that they had to say this, or whether or not it's basically that they felt we'd rather have Assad than have the devil that might come afterwards. In other words, we do not want the black flag. Same with the Christians under Mubarak in Egypt. And then the ensuing chaos that led after the Egyptian revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood. And as for the Gazans, they were probably the most closed community. It was the most difficult for me to penetrate that community, even though I've been working in Gaza since 1990. And I think basically most of the people said that Hamas did not bother them. What was more disturbing for them was their inability to leave Gaza to join their brethren in Bethlehem for Christmas or Easter, and the Israeli authorities prevented them from doing that. But absolutely, the link between Christians and dictators is very strong and very, very strange.
Right. And do you think that Christians, who would leave any of these countries could come to Britain and claim, under the UN definition, a reasonable fear of persecution? Because from what you'd say in your book, it's a pretty brave guy who keeps going to church right now in some of these areas where you become a target if you do so. Now, you also document in your book how they're leaving in in huge numbers. Ought they be going to Britain and America, and ought they be received because, perhaps because of interventions there a couple of decades ago? But they're no doubt under persecution now.
Absolutely. And I mean, so in 2016, 2017, when President Trump issued his Muslim ban on refugees coming to the US who were Muslim, that did not include Christians, Arab Christians. Now, remember, they're Arabs, but they're Christians. And for me, at that time, I was working for the UN Refugee Agency. It sent up a terrible message, which is that we have good refugees and we have bad refugees, i.e. good refugees being Christian. So Christian communities in Britain, in France, which is a Catholic country, in Spain, in Italy, and in the US, generally welcome. Canada as well is another big point where a lot of the Christians go, generally welcome these refugees, whereas Muslim refugees, especially now in the wake of the fall of the Taliban, are flooding Europe and elsewhere, and this has different considerations and concerns. Another thing is that the Taliban falling sends a terrible message for these Christian communities in the Middle East, because it basically means that other radical groups, and let's face it, the Islamic State might have been defeated, but they're not gone. They're regrouping, they're rebranding, they're recruiting under different methods. And there are numerous other groups that have been vastly empowered by the fall of the Taliban. So this leaves the Christian communities in Iraq, in Syria, in these other places even more vulnerable, which is why we really have to draw attention to their plight.
And Janine, you met lots of these Christians, these people who risked their lives to show up to church. Did you get a sense of why they were doing it? Why not simply worship in private? Why would you risk everything that you've got simply to show up at your normal place of worship? If you're a clergyman, why would you keep doing that when you knew you'd be a massive target for somebody and you'd be safer seeking exile in a faraway land?
The answer that I got over and over was one word: love. All of them told me, for instance, when the Islamic State rolled through Mosul, the Christians that got out, some of them got out at the very last minute, literally with the clothes on their backs and their documents, but others stayed in Mosul. And the ISIS basically gave them a choice. You can convert, or we kill you, or you pay a huge fee. And they took their farmland and they put the letter N for Nazarene over their door, marking them as followers of Jesus. Now, I totally agree with you. If I was tossed into the lion's den as a Christian in the Roman times, I'm not sure I could have withstood the torture. But these people feel that their faith is what identifies them. It's who they are. And we're talking about 2,000 years of faith and of history. So what they would say to me, why do they remain? Why don't they go to Britain? Why don't they convert to Islam? Because of their love, their profound and deep love of their faith, their link to the land, and their link to their religion, which is of the utmost importance to their identity.